I hear a guitar through concrete walls even now, 57 years after the fact, and I smell sweat mixed with floor wax and the metallic bite of keys on my belt. And I remember standing 10 feet from Johnny Cash while he sang about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die. And I remember the way every inmate in that room went silent when he hit that line. And I remember thinking I knew what kind of man I was until that moment proved me wrong. Here's what I need to tell you. That January morning in 1968, inside Folsom Prison, a performance turned into a reckoning. And the secret it forced out of me wasn't about Johnny or the inmates or the recording. It was about a line I had already crossed, and the one I was planning to cross again. So the question I've carried for decades is this: can a song save you from becoming the thing you're most afraid of? Or does it just show you what you've already become? I'm sitting in my house in Sacramento right now, a Thursday afternoon. The kind of dry winter light that makes everything look older than it is. And I'm 79 years old, and my hands shake when I hold a coffee cup. And I was a guard at Folsom for 11 years, starting in 1965 when I was 22 and stupid and sure that the world was divided cleanly into good men and bad men, and that I was one of the good ones. I'm telling you this now because I read that they're issuing the live album again, some 50th anniversary package or another. And every time I see Johnny's face on one of those covers, I feel the same thing I felt that day. Shame so thick it sits in my throat like a piece of bread I can't swallow. The truth matters now because I'm old enough that lies cost more than honesty, and because that day changed the course of my life in a way I never admitted to anyone. Not my wife, not my kids, not the chaplain I saw for 2 years after I quit the job. The question isn't whether Johnny knew what he did. I don't think he did. But whether a man can be forgiven for something he was about to do but didn't. And whether stopping yourself 1 minute before the act counts as virtue or just cowardice. We knew Johnny Cash was coming for weeks before he showed up. The warden made an announcement in December. Said Columbia Records wanted to do a live recording. Said it would be good for morale. Said we were expected to keep order, but let the men enjoy themselves within reason. And I remember thinking it was a stupid idea, because these men didn't deserve enjoyment. They deserved exactly what they got, which was time and walls, and the slow grind of days, that all looked the same. I was young then, young enough that I still thought punishment and justice were the same word. The morning of January 13th was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through concrete and makes your bones ache, and I reported for my shift at 6, and the cafeteria was already being torn apart. Chairs moved. A makeshift stage being built out of plywood and risers, cables running everywhere like veins. I was assigned to the floor, close to the stage, and my job was to watch the inmates, watch their hands, watch their eyes, make sure nobody did anything stupid when the adrenaline started pumping. I didn't care about Johnny Cash. I didn't care about country music. What I cared about was a man named Ruiz in cell block C, an inmate I had been planning to teach a lesson to for 3 weeks, and the plan was to catch him alone in the laundry corridor after the concert, when everyone was distracted and tired, and the lesson involved my fist in his ribs and making sure he understood that talking back to me in front of other guards wasn't something he'd do again. I'm not proud of that. I'm telling you because the withheld detail, the thing I haven't said yet, is what Ruiz had actually done to earn that beating, and I'll come back to that. Now, sitting here with the light going amber through my kitchen window, I can tell you that I think about Ruiz every day. I looked him up a few years ago, found out he got out in 1974, found out he died in 2003 in Modesto, and I never apologized, never wrote a letter, never did anything but carry the weight of what I almost did, and what that says about who I was did, and what that says about who I was. The stakes here aren't abstract. The stakes are that I was 25 years old, and I had decided that violence was a tool, that some men only understood pain, and that I was entitled to deliver it because I wore a uniform, and they wore denim. That performance, that hour and a half, on a January morning, cracked something open in me that I'd been keeping sealed. And I don't know if I'm telling you this to confess, or to warn you, or just to make sense of it before I run out of time. Here's what I remember, versus what I know for certainty. I know the date was January 13th, 1968. I know it was a Saturday. I know there were 2 shows, one in the morning and one after lunch, and I was assigned to the morning session. I know Johnny wore black and his voice sounded like gravel in a tin can, and I know the inmates went wild in a way I'd never seen, not rowdy but electric, like every man in that room had been holding his breath for years, and suddenly remembered how to exhale. What I remember, what feels true, but might just be the way memory reshapes things, is the texture of it. The smell of tobacco, even though smoking wasn't allowed. The heat from the stage lights making the air shimmer. The way Johnny's guitar looked too clean and new against the backdrop of chipped paint and rust. The way his eyes moved across the crowd like he was looking for something specific in each face. I remember that when he started into Folsom Prison Blues, the 3rd or 4th song in the set, the room changed. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite. It was a kind of focused silence, every man leaning forward, and I was standing near the left side of the stage with my back to the wall, and I could see their faces, and what I saw wasn't what I expected. When Johnny sang the line about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die, I expected the inmates to cheer, to howl, to treat it like a badge of honor, because isn't that what they were? Wasn't that the story we told ourselves about them? That they were animals who didn't value life. But they didn't cheer. A few of them nodded, slow and serious, and some of them looked down at their hands, and one guy in the 2nd row, a lifer named Thompson, who I'd always thought of as dead-eyed and empty, had tears on his face. And Johnny sang it straight, no smirk, no wink, just the flat truth of the lyric, and I realized in that moment that he wasn't celebrating it. He was confessing it, he was carrying it, and the men in that room understood the weight of it in a way I never had. They knew what it cost to take a life, or to take someone's dignity, or to become the kind of person who could do harm without flinching. And I was standing there with my keys and my club and my plan to hurt Ruiz, and I felt like Johnny was singing directly to me, like he could see through my uniform into the part of me that had gone rotten. The thing about Ruiz, the thing I haven't told you yet, is that what he did to earn my anger was this. He asked me, in front of 2 other guards, why I always walked the tier looking for trouble instead of looking for men who needed help. That's it. That was the crime. He didn't threaten me, didn't disrespect me in any real way. He just asked a question that made me feel small, and my response was going to be to break his ribs in a corridor where no cameras could see. I was going to do it because I could, because the system allowed it, because I had convinced myself that men like him didn't deserve questions. They deserved answers, delivered in pain. Johnny finished the song, and the place erupted, not with violence but with something like relief, like he'd named a thing they all carried and made it speakable. And I watched him take a sip of water and wipe his face with a handkerchief, and I thought, this man has more respect for these inmates than I do, and he doesn't even work here, and he'll leave in a few hours and go back to his life, and I'll still be here with my keys and my rage and my ugly little plan. The 2 timelines were colliding in my head, the me standing in the cafeteria watching a performance, and the me who was already rehearsing how I'd corner Ruiz later, where I had hit him so the bruises wouldn't show, what I'd say to make sure he stayed quiet. And the question I couldn't escape was whether I was any different from the men in those chairs, whether the only thing separating me from them was a paycheck and a uniform, whether I'd already crossed the line without noticing. Between songs, Johnny talked to the crowd like they were at a regular concert, not inmates, not criminals, just men. He made a joke about the food. He thanked them for having him. He said he'd wanted to play Folsom for years, because he'd always felt a connection to the men inside, and there was no pity in his voice, no condescension, just respect. And I saw the way the inmates responded, sitting up straighter, smiling, looking at each other like they'd been given something valuable, and I realized I had never once, in 3 years of working there, treated any of them with that kind of basic human regard. I had treated them like problems to be managed, threats to be contained, and on my worst days like targets. The convergence came toward the end of the set. Johnny played a song I didn't know, something slow, and between the verses I caught sight of Ruiz sitting in the back, 5 rows deep, and he was watching Johnny with this look of total absorption, and I thought, if I do what I'm planning to do, if I catch him in that corridor and hurt him, I'm not teaching him a lesson, I'm not enforcing order, I'm just adding more violence to a place already drowning in it. And the withheld detail, the final piece, is that Ruiz reminded me of my younger brother. Same build, same way of tilting his head when he listened. And my brother had died 2 years earlier in a car accident. And I think some part of me had been punishing Ruiz for being alive and asking questions, and reminding me of someone I couldn't save. It wasn't rational. It wasn't just. It was grief turned into cruelty. And Johnny's performance, his simple act of showing up and singing honestly and treating those men like they mattered, held a mirror up to what I'd become. After the show ended, after Johnny and his crew packed up and left, after the inmates were filed back to their cells and the cafeteria was cleaned and the chairs were stacked, I walked to the laundry corridor, the place I'd been planning to corner Ruiz. I stood there alone for 10 minutes, my hands clenched, my heart pounding, and I made a decision. I didn't go through with it. I walked back to the guard station, I finished my shift, and I went home, and I sat in my car in the driveway for an hour, and I cried for the first time since my brother's funeral. That concert didn't make me a good man overnight. I kept working at Folsom for 2 more years, and I made mistakes, and I was harder than I needed to be on plenty of occasions. But I never planned another beating. I never let myself slip into that place where violence felt like a solution. Johnny's performance drew a line, and I chose not to cross it, and that choice is the only thing I've ever done that I'm certain was right. The answer to the question I asked at the beginning, the one I've carried for 57 years, is this. A song can't save you, but it can stop you long enough to see yourself clearly, and if you're lucky, if you're still human enough to feel shame, that moment of clarity is enough to change direction. Johnny didn't know he was singing to me that day. He didn't know there was a guard in the room, wrestling with his own darkness. But he sang like it mattered, like the men listening mattered, and that respect, that simple act of treating people like people, made me realize I'd lost that somewhere along the way. Folsom Prison Blues is about being trapped and wanting freedom, but for me it became about recognizing the prison I'd built inside myself, the one made of anger and grief and the lie that some people don't deserve dignity. When Johnny sang about shooting a man just to watch him die, I heard it as a warning, not a boast, and I heard the inmates receive it the same way, and I understood that we were all, in our own ways, trying to figure out how to live with the things we'd done and the people we'd become. I think about that performance every time I hear a train whistle. I think about Ruiz, and I hope wherever he ended up after he got out, someone treated him better than I did. I think about Johnny, who's gone now, and I wish I could tell him thank you, though I don't know that he'd understand what for. Mostly I think about the line I almost crossed, and the fact that I didn't cross it, and whether that's enough to balance the scales, and I don't have an answer to that. But I know this. That morning in Folsom, surrounded by inmates and guards, and a country singer who cared more about the men in that room than most of the people paid to watch them, I learned that the difference between a good man and a bad one isn't where you start or what you've thought about doing. It's what you choose when the moment comes, and whether you're brave enough to stop yourself before the damage is done. So here's what I want to ask you if you're still listening. Have you ever had a moment where you saw yourself clearly, where something, a song, a conversation, a look on someone's face made you realize you were becoming someone you didn't want to be? And if you did, what did you do about it? Drop a comment and tell me about the moment that made you change course. Because I think we all need to hear that it's possible, that we're not locked into the worst versions of ourselves, that a line we haven't crossed yet is still a choice we can make.